This all started in February of 2016, so quite a ways into the 2016 campaign. And we found this out from some of these WikiLeaks emails where people within the Clinton campaign are starting to talk about their project against Donald Trump, their smear project, which they called the Swiftboat project. Hence, the book is called Swiftboating America. So it was the Clinton people who gave it that name because obviously they were not happy with what happened to John Kerry, the original kind of Swiftboat victim. I know people kind of have different views on that, but that's not my point. The point is it was the Clinton people who gave it that name. So they came up with this project where they were going to smear Donald Trump as a Russian agent. And in terms of whether it was sort of one of many things and so on, I think it was actually the core thing. It was their core campaign kind of hoax. It was their core October surprise that they were working towards. It was the big thing. And it had many, many elements which are discussed in the book. Now, in terms of whether the government was already involved, FBI and so on, back in February of 2016, I doubt that. I think it started off as a Clinton campaign hoax, and very quickly people within the government, James Comey and so on, saw an opportunity to run with it, to seize it, to weaponize it. But Flynn being Flynn, he didn't bite. So Comey sent in this guy called Strzok that we already talked about to interview Flynn. Comey later bragged about having done that on purpose as an ambush. So we made no qualms about the fact that this was a setup, but Flynn did not lie because Michael Flynn is Michael Flynn. And he just told them the truth, exactly what had happened. And then they made up what he supposedly said. So just without getting into too many details, they claimed he had lied about talking to the Russian ambassador about sanctions that were imposed on the Russians, and that Flynn and the Russian ambassador had discussed sanctions. And that Flynn later, when he talked to the FBI about it, denied that he had talked about sanctions. Well, it took us 4 years to finally get the transcript. Again, I mentioned it, the thing had been eavesdropped, so there was a transcript of the whole call. Guess what? Flynn never talked about sanctions.
I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored to have really bring forth the name of our show, which is False Facts Fixed. Somebody who is here to fix false facts. I mean, obviously they're not facts if they're false, but in the public narrative they have been. I came up with that term for my show because that's the definition of delusion, is when your facts are fixed but underlying they're false. So if I am convinced I'm Michael Jordan and I'm the greatest player on earth and so forth, that's a wonderful, fanciful thing, but it's wrong and I'm deluded. But we've been operating under kind of the aura of delusion, and to help us come out of it, to be the unhypnotic gentleman, we have Hans Mahncke with us today. And from his backdrop, you could see it's Swiftboating America is his book. And we're going to talk about what that means, what that was, and bring up all the cast of characters who are probably coming back into our view based on the fact that we had the incredible resurrection, as it were, of Donald Trump, 47 president, and even just I think yesterday he eliminated the security clearances of the attorneys at Perkins Coie. And if you don't know what that is, obviously Hans does. So Hans, tell us a little about yourself, how you got into unswiftboating America, and what's our recourse?
So first of all, this is not like my profession in terms of journalism or anything like that. I'm a lawyer. I spent many, many years teaching at many different universities, and I was very happy in that role. It's very just a nice thing to be doing. Is just all good. And then, of course, 2016 happened, and so much changed. And I was actually someone who supported Trump from the very first moment, June of 2015, just because I want to change. And even if the change brought a lot of destruction, doesn't matter. I could see the writing on the wall in terms of all the things, across the whole spectrum, deficit, immigration, trade, everything. Like, we need a reset here. And I thought he was exactly the guy that was needed. Initially, I didn't think he could get through the, Republican Party primaries, and everything was sort of rigged against him and so on. Anyway, he emerged victorious. But unfortunately, and this is how we get to the book, they kind of ruined his first term, and he wasn't really able to get much done, and mainly through this Russia collusion hoax. And I kind of started getting into this in about 2017, really, when it kind of first started, and then really getting into it in 2018, 19, when I could just see that all the elements of this hoax were not true. And if there's something that you can take away from this entire thing, and I think that's the one message, we can sort of load up the message on the front here instead of at the back, just to kind of see where this is all going. Everything was a hoax. Everything to do with Russiagate was untrue. It wasn't one of those things where, there's a bit of truth to it, and then, we build this a facade of other things around that, but at the core, there's some truth. That's often these hoaxes, and often politics works that way. This one is not like that. This one was entirely made up. The entire thing was a hoax. So I kind of got more and more into it, and eventually, and this is obviously, writing a book takes a long time. I didn't know that Trump was going to win re-election. I didn't know that it was going to be this incredible comeback. So when I was writing this, last year, and also 2023, I just didn't know what was going to happen. So the idea was to memorialize what we know, and mainly the fact that this was all made up. Everything was made up. So that's what the book is for, to memorialize what happened. And now we have an extra special opportunity, which we didn't know we were going to have, where we might actually hold people to account. This is not just for history that, one day someone in 20, 30 years can pick up this book and see what actually happened. But we can hopefully find some accountability in the here and now, which, I wasn't necessarily expecting, but I think that's great.
No, that's absolutely wonderful. I had the same impetus. I have a book we'll get to later when I do my exit. It's called Overturning Zika. And it was about a pandemic in 2015-16, Zika microcephaly, which had come and gone. It seemed all strange to me. And I came out at it a few years later, before COVID-19 was even a thought on anybody's mind. And I thought something's wrong here. And nobody would publish it because it's science. I wish finding out is kind of a little bit of a closed enterprise, as it were. So you think it's open thought and whatnot, but there's a lot of money flowing around here and there. So it's not a strict analogy, your situation, but I was rejected. I got into JAMA as a commentary piece, but then they rejected when COVID was just right on the corner, because it took me that long to get my proposal into these journals, as just as a 1,500 word article. And so at that point, I'm like, you know what, I have to write a book to memorialize this, kind of plant my flag on the moon and go from there, because I'll forget this stuff, but I have to do it while it's on top of mind. So it becomes kind of something you have to do. It hasn't gotten me a fortune or anything like that. And I don't know if yours has for you, but it sounds to me like you were driven and you had to get this stuff down and put it down, pen to paper or stylus to pixels, and whatnot. And I thank you for it. But I have to say, through reading it, there's a lot of names that seem quasi familiar to me, because I follow this stuff. But for a lot of, Joe Sixpack, whatever out there, I think these names might really be first time, witnessed. Danchenko and Papadopoulos and whatnot. I remember Carter Page. I remember Kleinsmith was the only person somewhat indicted over this. And then obviously there's Christopher Steele, somewhere lurking behind is Hillarie. Whatnot. Did this succeed? I'll give you one more Zika analogy. Zika microcephaly came about because physicians actually there wanted a strange new virus to happen in Northeast Brazil, oddly enough, because they wanted money and attention to come to Northeast Brazil. And they thought, if we have a calamity, everyone will start paying attention to a place nobody ever pays attention. So they got their wish, but it was much bigger than they ever thought would happen. And the thing fell apart and didn't ultimately turn out good for that area, because people believe in this kind of pestilence and they want to avoid it and whatnot. So did the people making this think it would actually fly, or did they ensure that it would because they had their contacts on the inside and kind of passed it, wink, wink, nudge, nudge through everybody? So this is a tall question, but give us the pieces on the Monopoly board or the chess pieces or whatever. Which moves happened, and did people think it was going to work right from the get-go, or was it just one of many things they were throwing up there, and with whatever landed?
There's kind of various elements to this. Now, at its core of what we know as to where it began, I think this is always very important in any kind of endeavor, any scholarly endeavor, where you try and get back to how did this all start. In the book, I go all the way back to 2014 with the Ukraine revolution and so on, but that's kind of more on background. In terms of what we actually know, what's documented, this all started in February of 2016. So quite a ways into the 2016 campaign. And we found this out from some of these WikiLeaks emails where people within the Clinton campaign are starting to talk about their project against Donald Trump, their smear project, which they called the Swiftboat project. Hence, the book is called Swiftboating America. So it was the Clinton people who gave it that name because obviously they were not happy with what happened to John Kerry, the original kind of Swiftboat victim. I know people kind of have different views on that, but that's not my point. The point is it was the Clinton people who gave it that name. So they came up with this project where they were going to smear Donald Trump as a Russian agent. And in terms of whether it was sort of one of many things and so on, I think it was actually the core thing. It was their core campaign kind of hoax. It was their core October surprise that they were working towards. It was the big thing. And it had many, many elements which are discussed in the book. Now, in terms of whether the government was already involved, FBI and so on, back in February of 2016, I doubt that. I think it started off as a Clinton campaign hoax, and very quickly people within the government, James Comey and so on, saw an opportunity to run with it, to seize it, to weaponize it. So I guess in answer to your question, it's a bit of everything.
Yeah, no, in my book, so it's again, not the same thing, but I come up with somebody else's use of the term conspiracy of interests. That is to say, there are conspiracies where everyone's like plots the whole thing from the beginning, but most conspiracies are actually not that. They come up with something, a lot of things are thrown up against the wall, and some things stick, and other people run with it. So the conspiracy of interest come along when something's there that other people find an opportunity to use. I think COVID had aspects of that. I don't think everyone predicted that this coronavirus was going to come around and whatnot, but once it was there, everyone tried to use it for his own purposes politically. And that became kind of Russiagate too, in a way. And the purpose, I think, for both those things was to get rid of Trump. And that seems to be the common theme through a lot of these, is that no matter what we'll do anything, whether it's, possibly assassination attempts and felony charges, all this kind of stuff. Everything's thrown against the wall. So this is one of the primary things that was thrown against the wall. What did this segue with the bugging of Trump Tower? And, how did all of this play out? And again, I want to kind of get through the ABCs of the chess pieces and whatnot. So, take it away.
So I completely agree with you. In my view, it was one of those that started off as a hoax, but a serious one. They intended to harm Trump very badly, but in terms of the campaign, in terms of getting Hillary elected. And if Hillary had gotten elected, we'd have never heard about any of it ever again. That was sort of the main purpose of it. In terms of the bugging and things like that, that's where the government comes in. So the government picked up on this pretty soon. We don't have a specific, we have a specific date when we can confirm, we have documented proof of government, not only involvement, but actual knowledge, which is July 28th, 2016. Very, very important date, because that's the date when Obama was told that this whole thing was a Hillary Clinton campaign hoax. So he knew. Many people don't know that. I think that's hugely important, that Obama, while he was still president, knew that, and he just let it go on. He let his intelligence services and so on go after Trump, even though he knew the whole thing was a hoax. Now, he might have known earlier. The government might have been involved earlier. The government, we'll get to the Steele dossier here in a moment, but they had the Steele dossier earlier than that. So there was probably stuff going on earlier than that. But in terms of what we have in a documented way, it's July 28th, 2016. So February 2016, the Clinton campaign starts this hoax. July 2016, the government not only gets involved, but knows about it. And then they start taking all these various measures. So you mentioned Carter Page here at the outset. So he was a Trump campaign advisor, and they just decided, the government decided, the FBI and DOJ decided they were going to go after this guy, and they were going to spy on this guy. And a lot has been said about these FISA warrants where he had his emails monitored and all that kind of stuff, which then, of course, allows an insight into other people, the one he's communicating with, and so on. So it's not just strictly Carter Page. It's sort of much wider at that point. But I think what's also important is they did horrendous things. They went and searched his apartment and things like that. It was also physical. It wasn't just sort of these digital surveillance. In terms of the Trump Tower being spied on, that's a very interesting one. So because we don't specifically know. We know stuff was going on, but we don't know specifically what was meant by that statement that Trump made back in March of 2017. It might have to do with the Carter Page stuff. It might have to do with something else, which is called the Alpha Bank hoax. That was also a Hillary Clinton. I don't want to kind of digress too far here, but that was also part of this Hillary Clinton Swiftboat project against Trump, where they created this false data trail pointing to Russia, where supposedly, just to think about it is just ludicrous. Trump and Putin were having these secret communications, and hence within Trump Tower there was the server, and it was pinging the Kremlin. It was just completely ludicrous stuff. So could that have to do with the surveillance, given that it was a hoax, given that this was like made up? There was no server. This was all made up by the Clinton people, helped by the FBI at this point. This is very important. By the time this Alpha Bank hoax happened, the FBI was really fully on board. So to answer your question, I'm not sure we know everything yet in terms of how far the surveillance went. We know parts of it. There was another guy, I think you mentioned earlier, Papadopoulos. They surveilled him. They had people within the campaign. We don't yet know the full story about that. But I think the important thing to take away from all this is that it was kind of an organic growth where the Clinton campaign started it and the government latched onto it. And then the government's involvement got just more intense day by day. It was just an incredible thing to watch. Like, well, of course, now from the future, looking back at what all these people did. And if you'd asked me back in 2016, would the FBI just latch on to a thing which they knew was a hoax, and would they then spy on the campaign, and would they just make up stories, and would they go to the court and lie? And I would have said, no, they wouldn't do that. And they did do all those things.
No, it's an incredible sadness. I think there was, Obama, his great quality was community organizer and activist and so forth. And I think he community organized the government into something different from what it had been. It had been there, ostensibly, like the post office, to kind of do something for the consumer one way or another. And I think he made it into kind of an eternal political machine. And so he politicized these agencies against mission, so that, we saw some aspects happen during the hurricanes, whatever, in North Carolina. People would avoid your home if you had a Trump sticker or banner outside. But I think that kind of was pervasive. And it's, I don't want to use the word too heavily, but it kind of a Sovietization of our government, so that you had to have a political party aspect to it. The communist rule, not everyone's a communist under communism. They have people who are party members, and they have to basically supervise the other tasks. So if you're building something, there's going to be somebody from the party there who makes sure that everything's said correctly and you don't stand outside the lines. And I think that kind of party aspect, that organization aspect, is really intrinsic to the Obama era, which basically continued through his 2 terms, and then his 3rd term of the Trump years, and then the 4th term under the Biden years. Now the Trump years had this subterfuge element where kind of like Gulliver and the Lilliputians, they managed to tie Trump, the giant, down with 1,000 lashes and 1,000 wounds and gashes and so forth, and they just were endless with this. But the Russiagate one was something that was kind of, I mean, it didn't have that term initially. It was used kind of a camel nose under the tent to get inside the administration, crowd everything else out. What happened with that? What were the, I guess, what were the gullible moments? What were the kind of sedition or treasonous moments if the FBI went with something that was knowingly a hoax? Who knew it, how, and when?
So the CIA director, John Brennan, knew it. He was the one who briefed Obama, July of 2016. In short order, James Comey, the FBI director, was informed, so he knew. The chief investigator on this Trump case, which was called Crossfire Hurricane, he knew. That guy was called Peter Strzok. So those names are probably kind of quite well known. All those guys knew. So everything they did was knowing that the whole thing is a hoax, which, when you think about it, it's surreal. But, that actually happened. Then you had some FBI agents on the kind of middle lower ranks who tried to push back. I mentioned this Alpha Bank hoax earlier, where they came up with the Clinton campaign came up with this hoax that Trump is having these secret communications with Putin, and this they set up this false data trail. So someone within the FBI looked at that, and a guy called Hellman. And he was like, within 2 milliseconds, it's like, this is a total joke. We have his text messages to some of his buddies on in his team, joking about how bad of a joke and how bad of a hoax it was. Well, and then Strzok and Comey immediately took it away from that guy because he was obviously not going to play ball. And they sent the Alpha Bank thing out to Chicago to some agents over there who played a role later on with Papadopoulos. I don't want to get into all the weeds of this. That's all in the book. But that's sedition. I mean, that's you deliberately take it away from someone who knows the truth and give it to someone who's going to play your game. So that's one example. The other, Michael Flynn is a horrific example of it's horrific what they did to him, where they knew he was communicating with the Russian ambassador after Trump won, because he was the incoming national security advisor. That's his job. That's what he does. They knew exactly what he said on his phone call with the Russian ambassador because they taped it. They were eavesdropping. He didn't say anything wrong. Everything that he said on the call was absolutely fine. Then Obama and Biden on January 5th, together with Comey, decided they were going to go after Michael Flynn. So this is 15 days before Trump came in on January 20th, 2017. And Biden being Biden, suggested something called the Logan Act, which is where private citizens aren't allowed to conduct diplomacy.
Unless you're a Democrat.
Comey's a much smarter guy than Biden. He knew that's pretty dumb. We're not going to do that. But Comey came up with a different idea. They're going to try and ambush Flynn in terms of getting him to lie about his phone call with the Russian ambassador. So it's kind of a perjury trap. That's what they tried on him. But Flynn being Flynn, he didn't bite. So Comey sent in this guy called Strzok that we already talked about to interview Flynn. Comey later bragged about having done that on purpose as an ambush. So we made no qualms about the fact that this was a setup. But Flynn did not lie, because Michael Flynn is Michael Flynn. And he just told them the truth, exactly what had happened. And then they made up what he supposedly said. So without getting into too many details, they claimed he had lied about talking to the Russian ambassador about sanctions that were imposed on the Russians, and that Flynn and the Russian ambassador had discussed sanctions, and that Flynn later, when he talked to the FBI about it, denied that he had talked about sanctions. Well, it took us 4 years to finally get the transcript. Again, I mentioned that the thing had been eavesdropped, so there was a transcript of the whole call. Guess what? Flynn never talked about sanctions. So they tried the perjury trap. It didn't work. And they were like, well, whatever. We'll just say that he lied. And that's how they went after Flynn. I mean, this is sedition. This is absolutely horrific. You'd never believe it if you didn't have all the documentary evidence, but we do. This actually happened.
So why did Flynn resign? Why didn't he just say, show me the tape?
And this is where the naivety comes in among the Trump crowd, and maybe with Mike Pence. I don't even know if it was naivety or not, but basically, He was accused of lying to Pence about the same issue, that he had told Pence he did not talk about sanctions, and that the DOJ was telling Pence and was telling Trump that he did talk about sanctions. And then the White House counsel at the time, this is January of 2017, this guy, Don McGahn, he also kind of took the side of DOJ on this. And of course, Sally Yates was the acting attorney general because Jeff Sessions hadn't been confirmed yet. And she was a big time Obama person. And to make a long story short, the Trump people who came in January 2017, they trusted Sally Yates, an Obama operative, over the word of Michael Flynn. That's why he resigned. That, in a nutshell, that's what happened. That in itself is just horrible. The most charitable explanation I have is that the Overton window was so different back then. The view of things that were possible was so much more narrow that people like McGahn, Pence, and so on would never believe that Sally Yates, the acting attorney general, would just be making it up.
Yeah, no, I get that. You know, we are living in interesting times. So the whole thing kind of got pushed up into the Trump, reign. How did it get advanced into, the investigation it was? I mean, I remember Jeff Sessions basically having to make some kind of deal or compromise with this, and what was the timetable? I think they managed to extend this thing endlessly. There was really no there. When did Robert Mueller realize, or Mueller realize that there was no there, to quote Gertrude Stein? And when did other kind of investigators, Michael Horowitz, whatever, I mean, how soon did they all figure this stuff out, and were they complicit?
The answer is we don't know in many of these cases. So we know about this July 28th briefing. We know that Strzok knew, we knew that Comey knew, we know that Obama knew, we know that Brennan knew, and probably various other people in that orbit. Whether Mueller found out and when he found out, or Horowitz and so on, we don't know for a fact. But let's just go through it very quickly here, because you mentioned Jeff Sessions. This is really important, because after Sally Yates lied about Flynn, and then Flynn got fired, eventually, of course, because she was only acting, she was replaced by Jeff Sessions. So then they had to get rid of Sessions because Yates was no longer there to do their bidding. So what did they do? They immediately got rid of Sessions. I mean, he was there for a couple of weeks before they sidelined him. I mean, he was nominally still the attorney general, but for all intents and purposes, he had been completely sidelined because they said he had to recuse himself from this Russiagate stuff. Instead, this is one of my biggest frustrations about this whole thing. Jeff Sessions, a lawyer, a guy who's been around forever. What did he not do? The first thing you should always do when someone asks you to recuse, which is, well, let me see the evidence. Let me see what you got. They just told him, look, you once spoke to the Russian ambassador, therefore you're involved, therefore you can't be attorney general with anything to do with this. And he was like, oh, okay. You don't do that. You say, well, yeah, I spoke to the Russian ambassador. What's that got to do with anything? What evidence is there anyway of any wrongdoing? Show me the evidence. And by that point, they would have already had, we haven't talked about, well, you mentioned him earlier. We talked about this, you mentioned this guy, Danchenko. By that point, the FBI had already talked to him. They had his statements as well. He disavowed the whole thing. So he's the main source for all these collusion allegations in the Steele dossier. He's the guy who supposedly came up with all these stories about Trump peeing on a bed and being spied on by the Russian security services, and all these lurid, horrible stories, and of course collusion, and this has been going on for many years and so on. So this is the guy. This is the guy who supposedly told Steele all of this stuff. He's your linchpin in a way in terms of a source. Well, he told the FBI on January 24th, 2017, very early on in the Trump administration, that none of it was true. This is just made up stuff. And that should have been the end of it, obviously. And by that point, we're not just talking about the major players like Comey and Obama and so on. We're talking about a whole bunch of people who were in the room. We're talking about FBI agents, a guy called Soma, a guy called Pienka, and various other people who by that point knew what the whole thing was. And yet, no one said. And then when Sessions recused, no one told Sessions, by the way, the whole thing is a hoax. And we already knew that back from July. And anyway, we know what doubly so now because the main source has told us the whole thing was a hoax. So sorry, they didn't tell Sessions that. They said you got to recuse, and he never asked any questions. And then in terms of what happened after that, in very short order, they Comey announced that there was this investigation, this Russia collusion investigation. He'd always said, no, the FBI doesn't talk about ongoing investigations, but in this case, he made an exception. And then in very short order, they got this Mueller guy appointed. Look, I don't know what he knew and when. I don't think he was very involved. I mean, I talked to some of the people who were interviewed by Mueller's team, and none of them ever saw Mueller. He just wasn't there. He wasn't involved in any of this. I think they just sat him in a room and gave him some coffee, and then they did their own thing. And by they, I mean people like Andrew Wiseman and so on. They had his what President Trump used to call the pit bulls, back in his Twitter days, which is exactly what they were. They were out to get him. He was smart. These were smart guys. They might not have known about the briefing that Obama had about this being a hoax confirmed, but all this other stuff, they would have known about Danchenko disavowing everything. They would have known all these other things. So they would have known very, very quickly that it was a hoax, which is why, and this is very interesting in terms of the end work product of this whole Mueller investigation, it's not about Russia collusion at all. It doesn't even talk about Steele at all. It just ignores all that, ignores Danchenko, they don't care about any of that. It only talks about obstruction. They immediately moved to obstruction because they knew there was no there. So, well, if there's no there, then you got to go via other routes. And the route that you choose here is the legal route where, well, they may not have been a crime, but then you lied about it, and then it became obstruction at that point.
No, it's craziness. That is amazing stuff. Lavrente Barilla, used to say, "Show me the man, I'll find you the crime." And that clearly they found their man. And then ever since they've been finding the crimes, as it were, or trying to, and pin the tail on the donkey kind of stuff, or the donkey's pinning the tail on Trump, actually, maybe a little more apt. So this guy Danchenko has got a Ukrainian last name. And was he in Russia during any of this episode, or is he an American? What's his provenance?
Yeah, they lied about that too. So such a good question. So let's start with Steele, because how did Steele get to work with this guy Danchenko? So one of the misconceptions out there is that the Hillary Clinton campaign hired Christopher Steele to write this dossier to accuse Trump of Russia collusion. In fact, the Hillary Clinton campaign hired Steele to repackage stories which the Clinton campaign had written. These are not original stories from Steele. These are stories that had been written by people like Cody Shearer, who's a longtime Clinton operative. And so we have something called the proto dossier from early on, April of 2016, where the same stories about the P tape and so on, the exact same stories already exist before Steele was ever hired. They hired this guy in order to give the whole thing a veneer of credibility. You got this former British spy and all this kind of stuff, where if he goes out to the media, if he goes to the FBI and tells them this, then it's super credible, and that's what we need him for. Now, Steele obviously wasn't comfortable just doing it just in his own name. So he hired this guy Danchenko, who was not based in Russia. He was based in D.C., and he had worked for many years in the Brookings Institution, which is, of course, sort of a Democrat, think tank to be charitable. And he basically then told Danchenko to tell him the stories, but he sort of gave Danchenko a guide, like, tell me about this, tell me about that. And then in a way, Danchenko was almost a patsy. So Danchenko would then either talk to some friends back home from Russia, even though I think he went to visit once, but he hadn't lived there for many, many years. He had actually come to the United States on one of these exchange programs many decades earlier, where they try and foster kind of understanding between the nations. And instead, this guy works against the new nation, which he must have known that's what he's doing, because Steele gave him some guideposts, do this. And then Danchenko came back, and Danchenko described it to the FBI that at times Steele wasn't sort of happy. So he had to kind of mold the story a bit more. But basically Danchenko was used as a patsy to sort of for Steele to then blame someone else if the whole thing ever kind of blew up. And so it was all made up, and Danchenko admitted that it was all made up. And Steele, in fact, has since said, well, but there was the source and it was not my fault, and so on. But I just say this because I think this is so important. I know we already kind of started off with this, but I'll say it again because it's so important. Everything was a hoax, not just the Steele dossier. I mean, I think even Democrats now kind of admit that, yeah, that was probably all made up. It wasn't just that. The entire thing was made up.
Are any of these actors actionable? Can we do anything? Can we find Christopher Steele? I don't know where he hangs out. Is he extraditable? Do they have any kind of legal liability? Is there going to be some ramifications? Obama seems to be, the Teflon Don, to borrow Mr. Trump's first name, but nothing sticks to him. How do we ravel or unravel all this stuff? Tie it into a new thread. Get rid of the old one. Mr. Biden, he seems to be, accessory after the fact, and probably bumbling through the whole thing. But there are other actors. I mean, Ms. Clinton, does she, are her fingerprints through the investigation? And we don't, we supposed to have jailed her for her own server and whatnot. What's up with that? What happens? It seems like the only person ever get prosecuted is Trump over and over again. He got prosecuted for the Ukraine thing when it was their crime. How do all these things relate? And does any of this relate to Hillary's, off the books server? And I think, kind of payola scheme to, monetize her influence at the State Department, presumably our, governmental largesse for, various countries, Paraguay or someplace wants something, they, spend $100,000 on Bill Clinton. I'm inventing Paraguay. And they get it. Hillary gets richer, and all this kind of stuff we're seeing with USAID and all this kind of slush fund money that they're getting rich on. What's the end point for this?
They ran out the clock. Is sort of the end point. So almost every crime is on this 5-year timeline. So from the time it started, it was committed to the time you get charged, no more than 5 years can pass. So almost everything we're looking at here is beyond that 5-year timeline. Now, there are exceptions and you can sort of reset the clock and so on, but it just gets really, really difficult after 5 years. The only people they did go after, and this just goes to show that the cover-up is often even worse. Well, in this case, it might not be worse than the crime, but equally bad, is you mentioned earlier there was this guy, Kleinsmith, who's the only one who was convicted of anything. He was an FBI lawyer, and he was horrific. He made up a lot of stuff. One of the things he made up was that Carter Page, the guy they spied on, was not a CIA source, even though he knew Carter Page was a CIA source. So anything that Carter Page did or didn't do has to be looked at through this prism of him being a CIA source. And Kleinsmith just said, nope, he's just some random guy. And then he went to the court, and that's how they got the warrant on Carter Page. Now, the judge in that case, who is the chief judge of the Foreign Surveillance Court, the FISA court, is a guy called James Boasberg. You know what he did? He just gave him a slap on the wrist. Oh, poor little guy. He didn't really understand what he was doing. Oh, so sorry. And yeah, he's back in practice. Everything back to normal for that guy. But the thing they didn't charge him with, and this was deliberate, is what we just talked about, whether Danchenko was based in Russia or not. That was the much bigger lie. So Kleinsmith knew that this guy, Danchenko, was based in D.C. He was working for think tanks in D.C. on the Democrat side. But instead of saying that, he lied about it. He told the court, no, this guy is based in Russia. Hence, he knows all these secrets. Without that, I don't think there would have been a surveillance warrant at all. So
where is Mr. Danchenko? Is he a good guy, bad guy? What's the deal? Did he just do this as a lark? Did he get paid? Did he renounce those payments? Can we have kind of truth and reconciliation hearings a la Mandela to figure out what's what? And, how Biden wrote a zillion pardons. How many people of this ilk got pardons, and how many of those are, will cover these issues? And will there be any kind of, reckoning for the bad actors?
in terms of Danchenko, I mean, he's certainly a bad actor because he knew that what he was doing was bad, and he knew these were lies, and he knew this was going to be very bad for Trump. Just making stuff up. At the same time, he was getting paid an absolute pittance. It's a couple of $1,000 sort of per assignment in terms of the bigger scheme of the risk he was taking and what he was doing. And I think importantly, he did fess up when the FBI came in January of 2017. He said, no, this was all made up. Or he didn't quite say made up. He said, no, this is just gossip. This is just people getting drunk and just making up stories and so on. He kind of described it in that way. Then instead of using him, as you suggest, to try and find out more and maybe giving him a pardon or giving him some kind of immunity to really get to what did he tell Steele and how involved was he in this whole scheme and on and on and on. Instead of doing any of those things, John Durham charged him with lying to the FBI, which is, and obviously he didn't lie to them about the fact that it was all made up because he told them it was made up. He lied about some peripheral things to do with, I think he was just trying to wash his own hands, just try and get some distance to it. That's not good, and I don't condone that, but I completely agree with you. That's the sort of guy you should have brought on your side to unravel the whole thing rather than go after him. But my theory is that they went after these small bit players in order to cover up, for the bigger thing, the bigger scheme of things.
Yeah, it seems a lot of times if Democrats go down, they go down, somebody else goes down for them, or they go down for something that's ancillary to the actual crime. In the Andrew Cuomo case, he shuttled 40,000 people from COVID hospitals into the nursing homes, and hilarity ensued along with death. But when they got rid of him, because of groping, something like that. So they don't want to point to the actual crime. And usually if Hillary does something or Obama does something, either nobody gets it or somebody totally trivial. And in this case, it seems like is there going to be some type of rewrite of the Obama era? And that kind of smoking gun you have there, has that been popularized much? I mean, frankly, this is the first time, maybe, I don't know, first, but I'm unaware of that particular date, July 28, 2016, as, pivotal until this minute. How much attention has there been to that moment, and how many people have been talking about the fact that Obama knew right from the get-go, but never said anything through the whole campaign, while he's presuming here and there, he's, campaigning for Hillary, that this Russia hoax was a hoax?
That's such a good point, and it's such an important date, and I think that's true. Most people don't know that Obama knew, and that Brennan knew, and that Comey knew, that they all knew it was a hoax, and then they pursued Trump anyway. The reason why we know this in the first place is back in 2020, in the sort of the final months of the first Trump administration, the then director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, released the memo that memorialized that July 28th meeting. So we know because of that. And that was, I have huge respect for him for various reasons, but that's probably the biggest reason, because he threw a lot of people under the bus, rightly so, but that there's a risk to him in sort of doing that. I think, unfortunately, what happened is because of COVID, and then because of Trump's loss, and because of the January 6th and all these kinds of things, all of that kind of just got lost in noise, I guess. And it's never really been picked up. But it's true, it happened. We have the documentary evidence. And even though we're not going to be able to hold these people legally accountable, I think it's really important to highlight this again and again and again, that Obama knew. And he not only didn't he do anything, and that's one thing, that's bad enough, but he then allowed the weaponization of his own government against Trump to be ramped up. What he should have done, of course, is to tell them to cut it out, to tell them, look, this is Hillary's little game, just stay out of it. Or even better, he should have gone to Hillary and said, hey, Hillary, don't do that. This affects our national security. You can't just make it up and accuse the other party's candidate of being a Russian agent. What if he becomes president? Then we've got a big problem as a country. Don't do that. Well, Obama didn't do any of those things. He just decided to pour gas on the fire.
It's amazing. And wow, it's a duplicitous realm. And I'm so sad that, various statutes might have run out. If I were, in the administration, I'd try to find out what things are pursuant to other things, because there are ways of getting around some of the statutes if certain information had not been available and then comes to light. But I'm not the lawyer in this room here, so I'm no real comment or standing. But so I have a couple of questions before we round out the hour. First of all, aside from great facial hair, what did John Durham bring to the table? A, and then B would be the kind of the follow-up question. Are you in contact with people within the administration or the Justice Department to bring justice to these various departments?
John Durham initially, I think, brought kind of a fresh view. I don't think he was compromised or anything like that. I think he was genuinely interested in finding out what was going on. And same for Bill Barr, who appointed John Durham for specifically this task. But then it all fell apart when Durham found the juicy bits, when he found out about, for instance, what we just talked about, this the fact that Obama had been briefed on this being a Hillary Clinton campaign hoax. That was way into the Durham's term. That was in sort of September 2020, when Durham had already been around for 2 years doing his thing. And by that point, Durham had already had his wings clipped. Now, we don't know whether he did that on his own or whether someone came and told him to shut it down, or we just don't know. We don't know enough about that. That's something we do need to find out about, because something that absolutely happened at some point in maybe late 2019, early 2020, at some point around there, Durham changed course. So he was tasked, you can look at his tasking document, to look at the FBI's or the government's role in weaponizing this hoax against Trump. That was his task. And the only people he ended up going after were some Clinton operatives. So, that just doesn't match. So something happened there. We don't know what that is. In terms of being in touch with people, no, I'm not. And I don't think this is a big priority right now. There's a lot of other things going on. In fact, I haven't heard much going on in relation to Russiagate, other than that firm you mentioned at the outset here, Perkins Coie, having their security clearances revoked, which is absolutely right. And
it was a timely moment for you. If we can figure out how to segue that, your words into action. But I would capitalize on that. I'll see, the people that I know who can put this out. I know somebody who knows somebody. I don't have great inroads, but I think we could try to see what can happen, because it is in the news. I mean, it's not out of the blue that he picked Perkins Coie. It's a hard enough name to pronounce, and the second one anyway. And so there's some there, and Trump said this was well deserved. And he must know about some of this. When did Donald Trump learn that the July 28, 2016 connivance, corruption, collaboration occurred between Brennan, presumably Comey, Obama, and the Hillary Clinton campaign hoax? When did Trump realize or know that this had happened?
I assume John Ratcliffe told him just before he told everyone else, September of 2020. I don't think Trump would have let that go, or would have not tweeted about it, or would not have made a big issue out of it in terms of the Mueller investigation, which tied him down for 2 years, had he known earlier. It's just such a huge piece of information.
Wouldn't that have been something like reasonable to point out? Like, they had it in for him back then. Why? I just don't know. He's a bombastic guy and voluble, and why wouldn't he not have put that out there? I just don't understand, because I'm pretty politically awake, following the news. I don't remember that being an item within that campaign, and certainly it was a close enough election, and ultimately that who knows, one thing or another. I mean, if Brennan had been discredited by that virtue of that 2016 memo, then he certainly wouldn't have had the weight to come out against Hunter Biden. I mean, you can't predict the future, but he comes out a month later saying, "Oh, the Hunter Biden laptop, blah blah blah." Well, if he had been discredited as having been, in an act of sedition, then the Hunter Biden laptop might have been like, "Oh, we don't believe these guys. Let's look at that," and that might have turned the election. I don't know. Plus, obviously, the election may have been turned in other, more surreptitious ways. See above. I don't know. You tell me.
I think all the oxygen was taken up by COVID during those months. That to me is probably the main reason why this happened. I mean, even the Hunter Biden laptop itself. I mean, the core of the story wasn't that there was a laptop. That was kind of ancillary. The main story that came out in the New York Post, and I think they very wisely chose that to be the main story, is that Joe Biden was having meetings with these Burisma people, these corrupt Ukrainian energy people, when he always denied it. So that never got any traction either. So I think COVID just kind of suffocated all these stories.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, they used our government as a vending machine. They sold our trinkets and they collected the coins. It's just kind of a sadness. They were selling favors within the government. Biden, and he got, I assume, I don't think the brightest, bulb on the tree, knife in the drawer, law student in the law school, member of the Senate or whatever. So I think Hillarie templated this. I'm not sure if she's the first person to really monetize, kind of a cabinet position the way she did. She left that administration, I mean, as half a billionaire practically. It's just incredible, growth for, somebody who really never held a private sector job ever, to get that kind of cash. And Biden's done not that badly himself, along with his family and whatnot. But they sold our favors over and over again. But yeah, it's a craziness. I've written a lot about the COVID episode, and I write for brownstone.org, and I've got 3 articles kind of on the Fauci, episodes and his hands and whatnot. But the last one really talks about the timeline, similar to what you're talking about with timeline. And March 2020 was this seminal moment where it was probably late February, early, there was initial meetings. But there was Fauci 1.0 and then Fauci 2.0, where he kind of turned, he changed his story, and he went with, I'm not going to call it a hoax, but let's say an exaggeration of what COVID was and wasn't. He was aware of the Diamond Princess, that people were not dying on the boat. There were 3,700 people and lots of elderly, 700 elderly, and nobody was dying by the time March rolled around. And they made a maneuver and a move, again, all the, same kind of thing, get rid of Trump. And I think they, told him it was a Chinese bioweapon. They made him overreact. He had not been doing that prior. He was saying it's a flu kind of thing. We had flus, we get over them, we'll move on with life. And the beginning of the lockdown was kind of the apple, the poison fruit that turned the administration. And ultimately, all these things have been, I kind of think in that my DNA of caring article, and that's Fauci's own term for himself. He has the DNA of caring. He cares so much about you, not himself and not politics. But was that Trump was the actual virus, that he had to be removed from the body politic. That he's the they formed this granuloma about him to expel him, and even before he got there, so they had immunity. They wanted to make the vaccine against Trump in this Russia thing, and then when it wasn't there anymore, they gave booster vaccines in more Russiagate stuff to continue it. And when that didn't work, they tried something else. They tried different kind of ways of fumigating him out of the place. And, so I think they even in February, they'd come up with the concept of mail-in ballots, that if we have a lockdown, if this, then that. If we have a lockdown, we're going to have mail-in ballots. And I think everything was there because Trump was popular. The economy was doing well through 2019 into 2020, and he was heading towards re-election. And so they just couldn't do it. And probably a lot of it has to do with the fact that they were going to be found complicit for, under the statute of limitations. If Trump had a second term, he'd be, gloves off, a little bit smarter. When obviously had this now, he's obviously, 4 years smarter. But even then, had he survived some of that stuff, we might have seen some, repercussions, ramifications, and prison terms, which, I think are sorely missing from this. This kind of gloves off approach, Nixonian, don't work. There's a letter I saw recently from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump back in the 80s or something, I think 1987, and pointing out his regret at not having fought back harder when 1960 election was kind of subterfuged or stolen or whatever. There were a lot of mysterious cemetery votes in Illinois, and that was kind of a turning point. It was a very close election, and he didn't say anything. And then Watergate happened, and he just kind of went away. But in that perspective, on a scale of 0 to Watergate, where do you put all this stuff? And again, let's say we'll put Watergate at the number 10. You can go above 10 if you want. So on a scale of 0 to Watergate to 100, Watergate's at 10. Where do you place the Trump Tower bugging, the Russiagate collusion, Obama's complicity, the lack of knowledge about all this stuff? And anyway, so where do you place this kind of on the scale of political chicanery, first of all?
I place it at a 12 easily. I think we haven't really talked yet about the consequences. We've talked about, the hoax and how it played out and so on. But the reason why I place it there is because the consequences have been so absolutely horrific. Of course, it's horrible to call your opponent a Russian agent when you made it up. It's even worse when the president of the United States is in on it, which is all that all happened. But I think the consequences are the worst part, because Trump had run in 2015-16 on this platform of, let's just talk to the Russians. We can't just always fight and so on. Let's try and talk to them. And the Russiagate hoax prevented that from happening. It just never happened. It criminalized diplomacy. So everything you see happening now in Ukraine and so on, also in a much wider picture, Russia being pushed into China's lap. You got this new, extremely dangerous alliance there now. All of that happened because Trump had he was hampered during his first term, more than hampered. He simply wasn't able to conduct any diplomacy because, people forget these things, but anytime he spoke to anyone with a Russian-sounding name, the media went totally apoplectic. When the Russian ambassador came to the White House, the media couldn't stop talking about it for weeks, as if that's the worst thing in the world when it's completely normal. When they had that meeting in Helsinki, Helsinki will always be stuck in my mind as just one of the biggest media meltdowns of all time. Oh my goodness, they're on the same stage. And Putin gave Trump a soccer football from the World Cup, which was just taking place in Russia at the time, which is a huge worldwide event and so on. Big deal. Baron Trump, the son, was 12 years old at the time, big soccer fan. It's like Putin goes, here's for Baron, a football. The media came up with these theories that it had a bugging device. It was some kind of all this. It was just unbelievable. In the end, what it meant, especially after Helsinki, it meant there was going to be no diplomacy. Trump just couldn't do anything. And then maybe one kind of final little anecdote here, which is many people don't know. The day that Mueller spoke before Congress in July of 2019 to admit that, maybe there was no collusion after all. We all remember that kind of train wreck performance. Well, guess what happened the next day? The very next morning is when this Ukraine impeachment hoax started. I'm not kidding. The exact next day.
It just never stopped.
So he just wasn't able to do anything, but that's the result of this Russia stuff. And unfortunately, that means we now live in a much, much different and much, much more dangerous world than we did before. I'd say the Russia being pushed into China's lap, which is what Trump is trying to undo right now. I personally think it's too late. But if he'd had a chance in 2017, yeah. But now, we've lost 8 years because of this stuff. Yeah, that is going to be the biggest fallout from this, like in terms of long-term consequences, in terms of things, our kids and grandkids are going to have to grapple with. That's going to be the one. And we'll be able to trace it back to this Hillary Clinton hoax.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, these lies are pernicious, and lies beget lies. And there we go down into hell, basically. So thank you so much, Hans, for coming on. I'm going to have people take a look at your book here. They can buy it. It's called Swiftboating America, and I'll try to get it in the screen here. Exposing the Russiagate fraud from the Steele dossier to the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane. So please go out and buy that. They can find you on X.com. Here you are, handsome as ever, and your Substack or webpage here is Truth Over News. That's not dissimilar from my topic, so they can read you and some of your co-authors here. And then if they want to help support my podcast, they can go buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's got a picture of me on the front here. And we talked on some of these topics, but, the basic message is that I guess, the good news about some of this stuff is once burned, twice shy. So we have a smarter Trump this time around, and whether people can, obviously we've seen the undressing. Not that we really want to visually see some of them, but the undressing of the legacy media. But the other thing that I guess kind of in the back of my head all this time was that stories, even false, if repeated enough. I mean, this is again kind of a Soviet thing, and I guess a standard bit of propaganda. I think Goebbels under Hitler said, a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. I think everybody who's old enough. I mean, now it's kind of passing through from memory, but 2008 election, which got us Obama. Sarah Palin was nominated, and a woman on top of the top of the ticket, VP. I mean, that's a big deal if it's Kamala Harris, but it's not a big deal if it's Sarah Palin. Everyone knows that she saw Russia from her porch. I mean, that never happened. That's Tina Fey, but it it just gets repeated enough that people think this. The same thing with all the tropes that still come out of the Charleston, good people on both sides. I lost a reporter friend of mine, an old classmate from 1,000 years ago, over the arthrogryposis story. The reporter with the odd hand, and supposedly Trump was mocking, but he'd been doing this kind of like motion years before he ever encountered that guy. He never met the guy in person. But these stories take on their weight. Hopefully, without the kind of supporting, scaffolding superstructure of your tax dollars getting funneled to them surreptitiously, aka the deep state apparatus. I think we're now seeing what that was. It's just a huge, one of those chocolate fountains you go to at a wedding. It was just like an endless chocolate supply, or champagne fountain, whatever. And people just kept replenishing and then going out and taking a few swipes at Trump and whatnot, and getting these stories and narratives falsely into the consciousness over and over again. Hopefully that kind of echo machine will not coincide with our existence much longer. And thanks partly to you. So I appreciate your time and effort in making the book and making yourself available for this conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It was a lovely chat.
All right. Well, perfect. Thanks. Nice meeting you, Hans.